Hello and welcome to a very different episode of Projector today as Gillian Anderson and Jason Isaacs walk the Salt Path, which has taken a darker turn after recent developments. After being swindled by a bad investment, Raina and Moth Wynn, played by Gillian Anderson and Jason Isaacs, lose everything in court, including their home, which is repossessed. Around the same time, Moth is diagnosed with a degenerative brain disease called CBD, with a life expectancy of only a few years. They decide to walk the 630-mile southwest coastal path while camping along the route and relying on their weekly tax credits for limited funds. Their journey proves difficult, but the Winds begin to adapt and their bond becomes stronger for it. The Salt Path is, or perhaps was, a very British success story. In 2013, the Winds took their long walk around the southwest coastal path, which runs around Somerset to Cornwall to Devon and Dorset, and Raina kept a diary of notes throughout their trek. She would use these to write her memoir, which was published in 2018 by Penguin and became an absolutely enormous hit, especially in independent bookstores. The book has sold 2 million copies to date and has had 2 follow-up books, The Wild Silence and Landlines, with a 4th book, On Winter Hill, originally set to be published in October, now currently delayed indefinitely at the time of this review. Whether or not it does actually get published at all is a bit up in the air now. And of course, it was turned into a film adaptation, which released a few weeks ago in UK cinemas, has become the sleeper hit of the summer. Again, especially at independent cinemas, where it's proved to be a major lifeline. The film was the feature directorial debut of Marianne Elliott, the acclaimed theatre director of War Horse and The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Night Time, and I saw The Salt Path in theatres recently with the idea of reviewing it, but admittedly I dragged my feet on doing a video on it because I didn't find the film all that engaging, and if I'm being really honest, I didn't think my audience would be all that interested in hearing about me talk about it. But sometimes procrastination pays off, as the biggest twist in the Salt Path story is not on the screen or in the book, and has taken a dark turn. In July 2025, The Observer released an investigative article about the Salt Path, and I highly recommend you read their report, which has made several discoveries and accusations that I'll paraphrase throughout this review. Now, note that you will hear me say the word allegedly a lot, because I need to cover my arse here for obvious reasons. The Observer identified the real names of the Winds and alleged that when Raina worked as a bookkeeper, she embezzled £64,000 from her employer. To pay this back, Raina allegedly took a high-interest loan with a distant relative secured against their home. This resulted in a debt that eventually led to them being taken to court and having their home repossessed. The Observer piece also disputed if they were truly homeless, as they own a second property in France which isn't currently habitable, but locals have claimed that they've stayed in a caravan on the land in the past. In response to these allegations, and others which I'll talk about later, Raina Wynn has said that she's currently seeking legal advice and called the Observer story, quote, misleading. Here's a quote from her statement. The Salt Path lays bare the physical and spiritual journey Moth and I shared, an experience that transformed us completely and altered the course of our lives. This is the true story of our journey. Raina Wynn has also released a lengthier response to the article, and she claims the embezzlement dispute is, quote, not the court case in the Salt Path. She goes on to say that, quote, mistakes were made in the business that she deeply regrets, which isn't really a denial, and also allegedly embezzling £64,000 goes well beyond the word mistake. Nevertheless, the Observer's allegations have caused a massive storm around the book, and by extension the film adaptation as well. Penguin has also put out a statement claiming it did, quote, all the necessary pre-publication due diligence, and until now, quote, had not received any concerns about the book's content. Number 9 Films and Shadowplay Features, who made the movie, have also shared the allegations are a matter for the book and its author. Quote, there were no known claims against the book at their time of optioning it, and they also did their own due diligence, and the film is quote, a faithful adaptation. Now, I don't hold the filmmakers responsible for what they didn't know, and I believe they were just doing their job in good faith, trying to bring a hit book to the screen. Nevertheless, these accusations have made me reassess the film under a very different lens. I also don't think you should feel bad if you're a fan of the book or the film. You were told a story was true, and there was no evidence to dispute that until now, so you had no reason to believe it wasn't true. It wasn't your job as readers or viewers to find these things, and the people's job it was have failed you. When we're told a story is true, we don't tend to be as critical of it, especially one of such hardship, because it might feel insensitive to question it. But also you wanted to believe it because The Salt Path is a compelling narrative, particularly as it claimed to be true. The book and the film present a story of resilience, self-reliance, and overcoming adversity, and the good nature of others. Who wouldn't want to believe in that? That's what makes these accusations feel so much like a betrayal. Audiences have had their trust and sympathies allegedly exploited, and it corrodes the positivity of its message. That said, it is worth noting that memoirs are usually a subjective truth anyway, because they're usually how the writer perceives the events, or sometimes how they want the audience to perceive them. But sometimes that can be stretched too far. However, the appeal of The Salt Path, I think, also speaks towards British culture at the moment. There's been a definite shift towards quiet pursuits like nature walks and camping ever since lockdown. We've had a lot of travelogue television series with celebrities exploring the walking trails and reconnecting with the natural world and all of that stuff. But that's also been reflected in the kind of British films being made of late, like Timothy Spall going across the UK in The Last Bus, or the bizarre Jim Broadbent movie The Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry. So The Salt Path is part of this subgenre aimed at older viewers. And you get people who watch these things and they develop all these fanciful ideas like, oh, I'm going to leave the big city and get a place in the country in this picturesque village and I'm going to grow my own food. Or they'll watch some episodes of Canal Boat Diaries and go, oh, I'm going to retire and live in a canal boat. And these are all very romantic notions until you hit up against a wall. Reality. Living like that is actually very difficult. It's hard work, especially if you're not prepared for it. But it's a very British kind of nomadic, off-the-grid dream, and The Salt Path scratches that itch. There is a part of me, even before the allegations, that thinks this has been born out of the policies of austerity in the UK. Everyone's familiar with the fantasy of wealth, being able to buy and do whatever you want, but this is like a perverse version of that, like a kind of aspirational austerity, where you lose your material comforts but are happier and freer for it, and then you become rich when you sell the book about it, so it all comes back around. That being said, The Salt Path makes abundantly clear that it isn't glamorous, and despite watching it in a scorching summer, I found myself bracing at the wind and elements. There's moments where dog walkers bang on their tent telling them they can't camp there, or a sequence where they have to quickly wake up and pack their tent because the tide is coming in, and I know for certain that I couldn't live like that. The reward, though, is a lot of stunning scenery, and the Salt Path film does work as a travelogue, as there is some fantastic location work all throughout the film that is exceptionally photographed. One of the more interesting things the film does is that the opening 20 minutes of it is in 185 flat, and then you get this big vista down the hill, and the aspect ratio widens out to 235 scope. The horizon opens up literally and symbolically. Perhaps understandably, the movie itself doesn't have a particularly strong through line. It's mostly episodic, lots of little vignettes as they go from place to place, meeting people along the way, most of whom only in passing. They'll show up somewhere and they'll get joined by a girl they sort of rescue, goes off to see her nan, or they go up to the top of a hill only to find the cafe is closed, and then they get given food by an employee as she dramatically quits her job. But there isn't a lot of substance tying it all together. One weird little subplot is that Moth keeps getting confused for the poet Simon Armitage because he's a lookalike, and this culminates in a sequence where, in order to get money for food, he busks to a crowd pretending to be Armitage, which, given the allegations of fraud, takes on an entirely different light, I think. But given the film's themes of homelessness and poverty, it surprisingly doesn't lean into the moments of righteous anger in the vein of something like Ken Loach. There's bits like the Winds being told they can't be given a house because Moth's condition isn't immediately fatal enough to qualify, or a moment where an automated payment leaves them with just £1.38 in their account, but not a consistent sense of injustice. It would be a more substantial film if it was more critical of a system where any one of us are just a few bad days away from losing our home. I had chalked some of this up to Rebecca Lenkiewicz' script, but the way the film tries to avoid too many specifics with how the Winds end up in their circumstances struck me as a strange weakness before, and now seems a bit suspect. The film actually covers this even less than the book, which has a personified villain named Cooper, but the film drops this except for a brief moment outside the courthouse with a character that just exits immediately. If there's anything that keeps the film engaging, it's the performances of Gillian Anderson and Jason Isaacs in the lead roles. Anderson struggles with the accent a little bit, but there's a lived-in quality to their acting that gives the story a feeling of authenticity. Anderson is especially good in the scene where bailiffs and police are knocking on the door to take their home away, and they're inside trying to cling to their last moments before they have to step outside and give it up. Just the agony and despair on her face. And The Salt Path is a love story that these two are absolutely committed to each other through sickness and health, no matter what. Their characters face the absolute worst of times, and losing that just reveals how much they deeply care and adore for each other. Isaacs and Anderson are good actors, and they give the material credibility. More credibility than it allegedly deserves. One of the more troubling accusations in the Observer expose concerns Moth's illness. It's claimed in the book and film that Moth has CBD, corticobasal degeneration, a rare, aggressive illness which is in the same family as Parkinson's disease. The life expectancy is around 6 to 8 years usually, but Moth has now surpassed this by quite some margin. The film, as stated previously, is a very faithful adaptation of the book, and this includes Moth's illness. At the start of the walk, he's clearly struggling physically, walking with a pronounced limp and unable to travel especially far. As the walk progresses, his physical symptoms begin to ease and disappear, and he regains his strength. Later on, when they live with a friend during the winter, his symptoms begin to return and then recede again when they resume their walk in better weather. In fact, his symptoms begin to improve so much that he stops taking his medication. And when I describe it like that, some of you might be a bit suspicious because it does sound a bit miraculous. And while there are some people that do beat the prognosis, this idea that he's effectively cured by reconnecting with nature, yeah, that has all the trappings of spiritualism. As the Observer points out, the sequel books follow an identical plot structure where Moth gets ill, and then he gets better when they go for a walk. And the Southwest Coastal Path is not a simple ramble, it has difficult and challenging terrain. That's something that's acknowledged even within the movie, but the idea of someone with a terminal condition with physical issues tackling it again seems a bit questionable. But perhaps most damningly, when the Observer presented their evidence to the charity PSPA, whom Moth had been an ambassador for, they terminated their affiliation with the book and the Winds. In response to these allegations, Raynor Winn has released letters from Moth's doctors, and he does obviously have some sort of condition. That's pretty clear in my opinion. But reading the letters, Moth's doctor does say that although they think it might be CBD, it was either atypical or, quote, this is an even more unusual syndrome, perhaps monogenetic. The books do feature a disclaimer that they're not meant to be taken as medical advice, but even so, the implications in the actual content are pretty clear, and these kind of ideas are bad enough in fictional narratives, let alone ones which are purporting to be real. Walking is good for you, there's no doubt about that, but apparently curing a degenerative illness that often leaves its sufferers unable to even walk. I'm not a doctor, but skeptical is a pretty big understatement. And others who have CBD, who have been recommended the book because of it or to take up walking, have been amongst those that have been most hurt by these allegations, as seen by the response and in the follow-up reporting, both in the fact that they related to Moth, but also in the suggestion that they simply haven't walked enough. And when you're living with such a diagnosis, it just makes things even more difficult. When I first saw The Salt Path, I thought it was a fairly middling film that wasn't especially compelling, but it was at least anchored by two strong actors and was pleasantly hopeful and harmless. But if these accusations are true, it definitely isn't harmless. So what happens now? The Salt Path isn't the first memoir to be held under scrutiny, and often in those cases they either disappear or get rebranded as fiction. That was the case for A Million Little Pieces, and that was debunked well before it was adapted into a film that only made clear just how unconvincing it was. But with these allegations in the air, a lot of the appeal and impact of the story is gone, and the story of an alleged embezzler is far less inspirational. And is it especially compelling on its own merits? Not really. The film has the performances and cinematography, but it retains a lot of the controversial elements of the book. Needless to say, I can't recommend this. Maybe I might have given it a pass before, but in light of the allegations, definitely not. If the book and film gave you hope and joy, then hold on to those things and just leave it behind. And if we've learnt anything from this, perhaps have a healthy skepticism of things presenting themselves as the truth. The truth can be stranger than fiction, but if it seems too good to be true, it might well be. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page or my YouTube Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. Or you can keep a roof over my head with my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, and you can also join YouTube memberships for similar perks. Or you can just simply like, share and subscribe. It really does help. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.